Fort McMurray is the commercial hub of northeast Alberta, at the heart of Canada's heavy oil industry. Long before the oil sand mines were developed, Fort McMurray was known for its rivers. The Athabasca River that flows east from the Rocky Mountains and bends north to the Arctic Ocean, and the Clearwater River that winds westward from Saskatchewan. Fort McMurray sits at the place where these two rivers meet, and the stretch of water at their confluence is called the Snye. It's a pretty still water that spans just over a kilometer east-west along the north side of downtown. The Snye has a dike at one end and a sandbar at the other. For more than a century, float planes have made the Snye their runway.
It's actually a Transport Canada registered float base. Whenever I get the opportunity, I kind of just splash down in the Snye.
Calvin Pilgrim is one of the few pilots who still lands here.
I mean, how can you not enjoy showing that off, right?
We leave our house in McMurray, downtown, and we come down and we untie the boat.
On most summer mornings, Jack Torchy Peden and his wife Mary Jane take a quick trip across the Snye.
And away we go.
Torchy has dodged float plane traffic on this river all his life.
I remember as a young boy, there was always planes landing and taking off in the Snye. As a boater, you had to be aware that you weren't going to be crossing in front of the path of an incoming plane or a plane that was getting ready to take off.
Since the 1920s, commercial float planes have docked on the Snye.
It was, at one time, one of the largest recorded airfields in all of Western Canada, if not the largest.
Because there was no aviation infrastructure in Fort McMurray at the time, the Snye offered the perfect ready-made base.
Float planes went where wheeled aircraft couldn't go.
In the Canadian Shield, it's very rocky. There's a lot of lakes and rivers. So before airplanes came, the fur traders were exploring the north, meeting up with Indigenous people, and they established a lot of forts along waterways. So when aviation started, they were using these same waterways, so float planes were able to land at those bases and in those rivers. And then in the wintertime, the lakes were frozen and flat, and they could land on skis.
Famous aviators like Wat May and Punch Dickens ran commercial float plane operations from the Snye.
It was the hub for all the mail being delivered to all points north, and that's right into the high Arctic.
The government had the Canadian Air Force flying up north and mapping northern Canada.
At Fort McMurray Airport, the McMurray Aviation Fleet includes 4 float planes on wheels. Owner Wade Komarniski got his start on the Snye.
I came to Fort McMurray in 1981 and managed to get a float endorsement and fell in love with that lifestyle. The number of locations a person can get to on a float plane is boundless, almost endless. The number of lakes far exceeds the number of runways.
As land-based airports expanded, float planes became less essential.
We're getting to be a dying breed. Seems like all the young guys are wanting to come out and go straight into the airlines.
When a float plane lands on the Snye these days, it draws a crowd.
You get lots of guys, as soon as they see me land, and they're bringing their kids over, and everybody's just excited just to see a float plane in the Snye, you know?
It's a pleasure to see a float plane coming in, for sure.
I would love to fly one.
Like people up in the restaurant there, as soon as they saw the float plane, everyone's out with their camera, looking out the window.
Sarika Kanzig says people were doubtful when she launched a high-end restaurant on the Snye.
My children thought I was crazy. Everybody in Fort McMurray thought, that's a crazy lady opening a restaurant on the waterfront. Nobody's going to go there.
Now, Sarika's on the Snye is a popular dining spot.
I thought it would be a really cool idea to showcase the waterfront and also to offer something in Fort McMurray that people could be very, very proud of.
Chef Shahan combines South Asian flavors with his imagination.
I come from Sri Lanka, so our Asian flavors, everything had to be a different flavors. For the pesto is go with the seafood, lobster like that, everything hit.
Everything on our menu is from all over the world, and it reflects the people that are in Fort McMurray. Everybody in Fort McMurray is from all over the world.
The name Snye comes from the French word for a river channel. The Snye used to flow in both directions, depending on the levels of the Athabasca and Clearwater rivers. Ever since the Snye was diked in 1964, it's been a still water.
The Canadian Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation would not allow investment into McMurray unless there was something done to curtail flooding within the lower town site. And the government decided that the best way to do it was putting the dike in there.
After the energy crisis in the early 1970s, a heavy oil boom brought massive growth to Fort McMurray.
So the infrastructure really wasn't there to support this influx of people. There wasn't enough housing, and there wasn't enough, even things like sewer lines and that kind of thing.
Métis who lived along the Snye were evicted to make way for new housing.
There was different developments happening in urban Fort McMurray at the time, or what was becoming an urban place. And folks were kind of continually pushed off of their land and would settle in the places that were left. And Moccasin Flats was one of the last remaining footholds for Indigenous people to freely settle.
Indigenous people have a long history on the Snye.
The Métis people would come here in the summertime and, you know, do the gardening and everything and bring their families up. And in the wintertime, they'd all go back to the trap line. So it was a great gathering space for all Indigenous people.
After the McMurray Métis commissioned a report on the Moccasin Flats evictions in 2018, the town gave back 8 acres of land on McDonald Island.
We're building a McMurray Métis Cultural Center here on Mac Island. It's a unique shape. It's in the shape of the infinity symbol. So it's just a step forward in the regionality for truth and reconciliation with the Métis people of this region.
A key recommendation in the Moccasin Flats report is to reopen the dike on the Snye.
As elders said to us in the interviews for the Moccasin Flats study, the dike kind of killed the Snye.
Storm drains bring sediment into the Snye, gradually filling it with mud and weeds.
Once the dike went in, it set the tone for the Snye. It never could flush itself out, and the sediment just kept building up.
Some believe that unless the dike is reopened, the Snye will gradually disappear.
My personal belief is that unless they fix the flow underneath the dike, it's doomed. It's going to slowly die. Do we really want to see that happen? It is a special part of Alberta, a big, huge part of McMurray.
Today, the Snye means many different things to many different people.
The amazing thing about this area is there are so many different people using this area in so many different ways. But that also poses a bit of a tricky situation in how do you plan redevelopment of an area where there are so many different user groups.
I like spending time with my friends and family and enjoying the weather and going kayaking or playing volleyball. We don't have to like travel far to go do something, and it's like right there.
Some think the Snye should be a beach.
I mean, they should clean this place up more and just make a beach area for the families and all that come down.
Families love to come here for a picnic.
Oh, it's the weather, the water, the view is just unbelievable. Yeah, we're having a good time here.
Fishermen try their luck.
I'm trying to catch some walleye. It's lovely, peaceful, gives me time to think about things.
And kids ride their skateboards in the park.
And that's what we've heard from the community is that this whole space needs to be kept a lot more natural and not a modern marina kind of style development down here.
Pilots would like to see float planes welcomed back to Fort McMurray.
We're still hoping that it would open back up again, at least with the tourism aspect, and use it as a stopping point on their way to Alaska or the far north, which it used to be years ago.
The Snye, a beautiful landmark in the heart of Fort McMurray. A precious piece of water with a storied past. And a future that's up in the air.
When they built the dike in 1964, that was also to qualify for new town status. I believe that there was something to do with expanding the land base of the community by extending it to McDonald Island that increased the footprint and helped them qualify for that. And that gave them more funding for bigger political organization. Part of it was about trying to manage floodwaters from the Athabasca River. But another thing was that the design recommendations were for two 24-foot culverts, so massive culverts. Instead, they put two 24-inch culverts in. And so what the difference between what was, even if it wasn't going to be a bridge and it was going to be a dike, the difference between what was proposed and what actually got built was very different. The main thing with before they put the dike in was that water flowed from both rivers. So at the moment, it's kind of, it's even almost blocked off on the Clearwater side. So that Fort McMurray is the confluence of the Clearwater and the Athabasca rivers. And before they put the dike in, water was able to come through from the Athabasca as well as from the Clearwater. The Clearwater River goes all the way into Saskatchewan, and the Athabasca River goes way down southern Alberta and towards the Rockies. And of course, the Athabasca River also goes north into the Northwest Territories. So it really was like kind of a connection point that gave people access to, the whole world is what we heard from some people. One key thing to know about bitumen is that, and its uses in upgrading to synthetic oil, is that people have known about the extent of the deposit for decades. Like it predates knowledge of oil in southern Alberta even. But it's always just been super expensive and difficult to get out of the ground and do anything useful with. So it's always been something that's only really been developed during crisis. So the Second World War was one of the first big pushes. And then what happened in the 1970s was, oil companies from the US, especially Sun Oil, started getting interested as the Cold War started to escalate. But then in 1973, the energy crisis triggered by U.S. conflict with the Middle East and the OPEC energy embargo, that just caused prices to skyrocket. And so suddenly all these oil companies were like, okay, well now it's economic. And not only that, but exports from the Middle East are compromised. So there's a huge rush into Fort McMurray and just this big push to build new plants. And so the first one was Great Canadian Oil Sands, that was built in 1967. So that kind of predates this. But then the second one, Syncrude, that was built through the 1970s, and I believe opened in 1978. There was nowhere for workers to live, and so there was a huge push to develop housing, and so there were lots of residential neighborhoods built. It reduced those people to being illegal occupants rather than the descendants of a people who had lived on those shores for centuries.
Through doing the report, we learned that this story of Moccasin Flats is not unique to Fort McMurray. There are stories like Moccasin Flats all across Alberta, all across Canada. And we spoke with some folks who are living in other places in Alberta even, who told us stories about other forced relocations that happened under similar circumstances. So one of the main learnings for me from this project that I've taken with me into all my work now that I do, and hopefully into the future, is that settler colonialism in Canada isn't this thing that operates in a one-time event where, the government comes in with guns or the RCMP comes in and just kicks everybody out of their land. But it's something that's slow and that happens over time and is always kind of incomplete. So we still see forced relocations happening today.
Float planes were really responsible for kind of opening up the north and opening up aviation in the north. In the Canadian Shield, it's very rocky, but there's a lot of lakes. So using float planes and amphibious aircraft, they flew all across northern Canada using cameras to photograph the ground. It really opens up the entire north because there's so many accessible lakes and rivers that are frozen in the wintertime. So in the summertime, you can land on floats. In the wintertime, everything's frozen, you can land on the snow. So it really opens up a world of possibilities and goes from 0 airports to really an almost unlimited amount of airports throughout the north. Very early on, it was really tied to the fur trade. So they were working with the fur traders at forts throughout northern Alberta and Northwest Territories, bringing fur back to southern cities. They were also bringing government officials north, priests, nuns, and then of course airmail. So in Fort McMurray, that was the northern terminus of the railway. So from Fort McMurray, it was a really long slog to get north through, boats and teams of dog sleds. So when airmail started from Fort McMurray, it really opened up all of those forts to constant communication with southern Alberta, southern Canada. So once aviation started, they were able to haul people, equipment, supplies much easier and at much greater pace than they could before. So it really launched the exploitation of the north exponentially overnight. There was a lot of forts that did not have particularly good conditions for aviation. They were either in narrow passes, the river was turbulent or rocky. So at Fort McMurray, the Snye was a really calm, natural harbor between the two rivers. So it provided a really safe and really flat, straight, accessible float plane brace. So it was perfect conditions for establishing northern operations. So the Snye and in Fort McMurray was really the northern hub of operations until further airports were established. But Western Canada Airways stopped there, bringing the airmail north, and they were the first ones to really try airmail and bring airmail north, bring fur south. And that really proved that it was a particularly important hub. Very difficult conditions. They did not have good maps of the area. If they were flying along a waterway like the Mackenzie River, then they had the river to follow. But to reach more remote locations, they were essentially in the dark. There was fog, poor conditions, snowstorms that they had to fly through. And the machines that they were using were not particularly reliable, so often they had to put down in a field or in an unknown lake and hope for the best. There's one story of Punch Dickens, who was flying north, and he was forced to put down out of gas, and just a couple days later a steamboat showed up with a fuel cache that was bringing fuel to supply his base, so it happened to work out particularly well for him. If you're leaving from the south and flying north, there's certain times of the year that the conditions don't match. So if you leave Edmonton on a float plane and you get to Fort McMurray and the Snye is frozen, you're in a world of trouble. So there was periods where essentially nothing happened and passengers and cargo backed up until conditions were right and they could make that connection. But times were tight in the 30s, and the economy in Canada was not particularly strong, so their profit margin was very thin. So it led to them pushing that margin. So there's several times that they would land on a frozen lake, park their aircraft overnight, and found it sunk in the next day because it broke through the ice. So there was a lot of heartache and a lot of written off aircraft because of this. So Watt May was originally from Manitoba, grew up in Edmonton. He was one of the people to see the first aircraft actually take off in Edmonton during the exhibition, and really wanted to fly. But at the time, it was really difficult. There was no flying. There was no flying clubs, so it was kind of impossible. So during the First World War, he signed up for the Canadian Army, served as an infantry officer, and then was transferred to the Royal Flying Corps. So he learned to fly in 1917, got posted to the front. And in one of his first combat missions, he was actually almost killed by the Red Baron. Watt May formed Commercial Airways with his partner Vic Horner, and they were the ones that really started opening up northern flying and connecting Fort McMurray. And they really started establishing further aviation connections to the north. So they established a base at Fort McMurray so they could service their aircraft, and they got the government contract to fly airmail up to Aklavik.